The man at the dying wells. The war for the Ashen Expanse had burned so long that even memory felt scorched. Once the desert had possessed a kind of cruel beauty. At dawn, the dunes glowed rose gold like sleeping embers. At dusk, the horizon bled into violet haze while wind combed ripples across endless sand. Merchants had crossed it in bright caravans, singing to ward off loneliness. Pilgrims had braved it to reach shrines carved into black rock mesas. Even dragons had flown its thermals in slow, sovereign spirals, their shadows gliding like drifting continents across the earth. Now there was only ruins. Siege towers lay collapsed in skeletal heaps, their iron ribs twisted by heat beyond forging. Broken ballistae jutted from the dunes like fossilized beasts. The bones of men and horses and things not wholly either gleamed white where scavengers had stripped them clean. The sky, perpetually veiled by drifting ash from distant bombardments, hung dim and colorless overhead. The kingdom of Havre had advanced too far into draconic territory, and the dragons had answered. Fire met steel, wingbeat met war drum. The expanse became a wound that refused to close. Between the last forward bastion of Havre and the outer airy lines of the draconic host lay a stretch of land neither side claimed anymore. It was too exposed to hold, too costly to contest. Patrols skirted its edges. Scouts crossed it in silence and haste. And in that forsaken strip of sand, a lone human walked. Garrick Thorne had once marched at the head of companies. Now he walked alone, leaning slightly to his left where an old spear wound stiffened in cold nights. The desert heat did not trouble him as it once might have. He had grown lean in the war, carved down to sinew and endurance. His beard, once trimmed with military neatness, had grown rough and silver-flecked. His hair clung in damp strands to his temples. He wore no insignia. His armor had been traded months ago for dried meat and a mule that had not survived the next skirmish. His sword, steel from the high forges of Havre, had shattered at Red Mesa when a dragon's tail struck the parapet where he stood. The fragments lay buried somewhere beneath sand and ash. All he carried now was a canvas pack light enough to mock him, and a dented iron canteen at his hip. Inside it, one swallow of water. Perhaps two if he were willing to pretend. He did not pretend. Garrick crested a low ridge near sunset and paused, breathing through cracked lips. The air tasted like soot and old copper. Below him lay what had once been a waystation well, a circular stone mouth set into a shallow basin, ringed by tumbled pillars that had supported an awning long ago. He stared at it for a long moment before descending. Hope was a habit he had not entirely broken, though war had tried. Each step down the slope sent small avalanches of sand sliding around his boots. When he reached the well, he knelt and brushed ash from its rim. The stones were fractured inward. The pulley had been hacked apart, the rope lay in two charred lengths at the bottom of the basin. He peered into the darkness. Nothing but dust and the faint glimmer of broken bucket staves. Poisoned most likely or collapsed. Garrick rested his forehead briefly against the cool stone and let out a breath that shuddered more than he liked. Of course, he murmured. He lowered himself to sit with his back against the well. The stone pressed firm and reassuring against his spine. The desert wind slid through the basin in restless sighs, lifting strands of his hair and whispering over the empty mouth of the well like a ghost remembering water. He unslung the canteen. The metal felt warmer than his palm. He rotated it slowly, listening to the faint slosh within, a thin sound, fragile. He uncorked it and lifted it to his lips. He stopped there. His throat burned, his tongue felt like leather. Every instinct screamed at him to drink now, to drain it and feel the brief blessed relief. Instead, he lowered it. Night would be colder, he might need the strength then. Or perhaps that was simply the stubborn pride of a soldier who refused to concede even to thirst. He set the canteen beside him and leaned his head back against the stone, closing his eyes. He did not sleep. Sleep in open desert during wartime was an invitation to never wake again. The first shadow passed overhead without sound. Garrick's eyes opened. He did not move. Another shadow followed, larger, slower. His hand drifted instinctively toward his hip, toward a sword that was no longer there. His fingers curled against empty air. He exhaled slowly and tilted his head back. Three shapes circled against the dimming sky. Dragons. Not the towering ancients whose wings could blot out entire battalions in darkness. These were leaner, smaller, though small remained a relative term. Their wings bore rents and tears. One flew unevenly, its left side dipping slightly with each strained beat. They were descending. Garrick pushed himself to his feet with deliberate calm. He had seen dragons descend in attack formations, tight spirals that ended in plummeting dives, claws extended, jaws blazing. This was not that. Their landing was ragged. Sand exploded outward as they struck ground beyond the basin, sliding several yards before coming to an unsteady halt. One stumbled outright, collapsing to one knee. The smell reached him moments later. Blood. Not humans. Hotter, sharper, laced with faint ozone and smoke. Garrick climbed halfway up the basin's edge to see more clearly. The three dragon warriors stood, or tried to stand, in the shallow ravine beyond. Bronze harnesses strapped across their scaled chests held long spears and empty flask brackets. One wing of the largest dragon hung at an unnatural angle, membrane torn where iron bolts had punched through. Another dragon slider, her scales a muted copper, limped heavily, one hind leg dark with drying blood. The third kept watch, head swiveling sharply despite visible exhaustion. They had not seen him yet. Garrick's jaw tightened. He had fought their kind, gods, how he had fought them. He had stood beneath raining fire and ordered archers to hold formation as wings blotted out the sun. He had watched comrades reduced to silhouettes against blazing walls. He bore scars from dragon claws. He bore grief from dragon flame. And yet, he watched the largest dragon attempt to stretch its injured wing and fail, watched pain ripple visibly through its massive frame, watched the copper-scaled one sag where she stood. They were not huntings. They were not triumphants. They were dyings. The third dragon's head snapped toward him. Golden eyes locked onto his position. A low growl rolled across the sand, deep enough to vibrate in Garrick's ribs. The other two turned. Now all three saw him. For a heartbeat, the desert held still. Garrick descended the basin slope slowly until he stood in clear view at its edge. He did not raise his hands, he did not kneel. He simply stood. The watchful dragon shifted forward a half-step, claws carving trenches in sand. Its nostrils flared. Smoke threaded weakly from them, but there was no flare of imminent flame. The largest dragon lifted its head higher, though the motion cost it visibly. They assessed him. Unarmored, unarmed, alones. Garrick assessed them in turn. Three warriors, battle-worn, thirst-cracked, scales near their mouths, harness flasks empty. His gaze drifted to his canteen. The weight of it at his hip suddenly felt monumental. The desert wind gusted, carrying the scent of blood and ash between them. The watchful dragon took another step. Garrick felt his pulse thud once in his throat. He reached slowly to his belt. The dragons tensed as one, claws flexed, wings twitched. Garrick drew the canteen free. The faint slosh sounded impossibly loud. Golden eyes snapped to it. So that was it. Thirst. Of course. Dragonfire consumed, wings demanded strength, blood loss drained more than vitality. Water was life. Garrick looked down at the canteen in his hand. He could drink it now, turn away, walk until his legs failed. The dragons would either die or recover without him. They were the enemies. He had buried men because of their kind. He thought of Red Mesa, of flames cresting stone walls, of Captain Hellrun's scream cut short. He thought of villages scorched in retaliation raids on both sides. War had become a machine devouring anything fed into it. He thought, too, of something older. A memory from youth before command and campaigns, crossing the southern flats with his father during a drought year. Their own waterskins nearly empty. A stranger, no allegiance, no banner, had shared from his own supply. In the desert, his father had told him later, water's older than war. The dragons watched him without blinking. Garrick exhaled through his nose. War's done enough, he muttered. He stepped forward and sand shifted treacherously underfoot, but he did not falter. He stopped several paces from the nearest dragon, close enough to see the fine cracks along its scales where heat had dried them, close enough to see pain held tight in its gaze. He crouched. Slowly, deliberately, he set the canteen on the sand between them. Then he rose and stepped back. He did not run. He did not bow. He simply removed his hand from the choice and let it lie there. The watchful dragon's growl deepened uncertainly. Its eyes flicked from the canteen to Garrick and back again. The copper-scaled dragon swayed slightly. The largest lowered its head a fraction. Garrick clasped his hands loosely behind his back to keep them from shaking. If I meant to kill you, he rasped, voice dry as the well behind him, I'd have done it years ago. They could not understand the words. But they understood tone. The largest dragon extended its neck slowly, every movement cautious. Its nostrils hovered inches above the canteen. It inhaled. No poison. No oils. Just water. It nudged the canteen lightly with the tip of one claw. The metal rolled, catching the last light of sunset. Garrick did not move. Another breath. Then carefully, almost delicately, the dragon hooked one claw through the strap and lifted the canteen. The metal looked absurdly small in its grasp. It tipped. Water flowed, a single thin stream into waiting jaws. The dragon swallowed. Its throat worked once, twice. Then the canteen was empty. It lowered the vessel slowly and placed it back upon the sand. Not discarded. Placed. The other two dragons watched in silence. The largest met Garrick's eyes again. Something had shifted there. Not gratitude, not yet. Recognition. It lowered its massive head, not fully, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Garrick felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. He inclined his own head in return. The wind moved through the ravine, gentler now. For a long moment, no one did anything. The desert seemed to breathe around them, ash drifting, sand settling, dusk deepening toward night. 3 dragon warriors. 1 unarmed human veterans. An empty canteen between them. In another place, another hour, they would have torn one another apart. Here, at a dying well under a darkening sky, they simply stood. And the war, vast and merciless as it was, paused just enough to notice. The weight of a drop. The desert did not applaud mercy. It did not soften its winds or cool its breath in approval. The ashen expanse remained what it had always been, vast, indifferent, and merciless to the weak. The last light of sunset drained from the dunes, leaving the world washed in bruised purples and cold iron gray. But something had changed. The empty canteen lay between Garrick Thorne and the dragon warriors like a relic of a forgotten age. The largest dragon, the one who had drunk, kept his gaze fixed on the human. His scales were a deep ember red, darkened in places by soot and streaked with blood that had dried into blackened lines along his flank. One bronze harness strap had been sheared cleanly by a blade strike, another hung loose where a fastening had melted under extreme heat. He breathed slowly, carefully, conserving what strength remained. His name was Valor of the Ember Phalanx, 3rd Spear beneath the command of Sky Marshal Rendorix. He had fought in 5 major engagements and countless skirmishes since the war ignited. He had broken cavalry lines. He had burned siege towers. He had carried wounded Clutchkin through storms of iron-tipped bolts. He had also watched 2 of his Clutch siblings fall from the sky, wings shredded by human ballistae. He had sworn never to forget the sound their bodies made when they struck the ground. And yet, a human had just given him water. Valor's golden eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in bewilderment. Behind him, the copper-scaled dragon shifted her weight with a soft rasp of pain. Her name was Sarathine, 2nd flame of their unit. Blood seeped sluggishly from a gash along her hind leg where a halberd had found purchase between scales. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale edged with a faint whistle. The 3rd dragon, leaner and slate gray, was Kedron, their rear guard and youngest among them. His left horn was cracked near the base, a souvenir from a collapsing watchtower he had misjudged in his dive. Kedron's gaze flicked repeatedly from Garrick to Valor and back again. He stands too calmly, Kedron murmured in the draconic tongue, voice low and tense. Humans do not approach us so without purpose. Sarathine's tail dragged faint lines in the sand. He is alone, she replied, her tone frayed by exhaustion, and thirsty. Valor did not answer immediately. He studied the human's face instead. Garrick stood with hands loosely clasped behind his back, posture steady despite the visible tremor in his fingers. His lips were cracked and pale. His skin bore the leathery hue of prolonged exposure to sun and wind. Sweat had dried in salt streaks along his temples. He had not drunk. Valor had seen the hesitation, the subtle tightening of the human's throat before he chose to set the canteen down. He had given his last. Valor inhaled slowly, drawing in the human scent, dust, old steel, fatigue. A thread of stubborn will that did not waver even beneath the weight of dragon scrutiny. This is folly, Kedron said softly, a trick to lower our guard. Sarathine's gaze drifted toward the empty harness brackets at her chest. If it is a trick, it is poorly timed. Valor lifted his injured wing slightly and suppressed a flare of pain. Iron bolts had pierced the membrane earlier that day when their formation strafed a supply caravan near the Havre border. The retaliation had been swift. Hidden artillery units had emerged from sand-camouflaged pits. Explosive charges, new human inventions, had burst in air around them, shredding leather harness and scale alike. They had lost 2 more warriors in the retreat. By the time Valor signaled disengagement, their flight path had already veered dangerously close to the unclaimed stretch between territories. Winds had worsened. Visibility had faltered. They had chosen the ravine for concealment. They had not expected to find a human at its edge. Valor's gaze returned to Garrick. The human did not flinch under scrutiny. He did not attempt to speak further. He simply stood thin shadow against dimming sky, waiting. Valor felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not weaknesses. Not pity. Recognition. Among dragonkind, there existed an ancient law older than territorial claims and older than the formalization of war rights. It was rarely invoked in recent centuries, for pride had grown large in their kind and resources were seldom scarce in the heights they commanded. But the law remained. Water given freely in a barren land bound debtor to giver. Not as servant, not as subordinate, but as one who owed life. Valor had been raised on stories of that law. He had never expected to stand within it. Slowly ignoring the protest of torn muscle, Valor reached one clawed forelimb to his harness. Kadron's head snapped toward him. What are you doing? Valor unclipped a small object secured beneath layered bronze plates. A crystal vial stoppered with silver and wrapped in braided cord. Sarathine's eyes widened slightly despite her fatigue. That is Stormwater Reserve. Yes, Valor replied. Kadron hissed softly. It is for dragon need, not for. For life, Valor interrupted. He stepped forward. Garrick tensed involuntarily as the massive form approached, though he forced himself not to retreat. His heart hammered once hard enough that he felt it in his jaw. The dragon stopped at a distance, mirroring Garrick's earlier approach, close, but not threateningly so. Valor lowered his head and set the crystal vial gently upon the sand. The glass caught the last fragment of sunset, refracting faint blue light across the ravine floor. Garrick blinked. He stared at the vial, then up at the dragon, then back again. You don't have to, he said quietly. The dragon could not understand the words, but the tone carried. Valor's tail struck the sand once, firm, decisive. Yes, he did. Garrick hesitated only a moment longer before stepping forward. He crouched slowly, every movement measured. His hand hovered above the vial briefly, as though expecting it to vanish or explode. It did neither. He lifted it. The glass felt cool against his calloused palm. Condensation beaded faintly along its surface despite the desert's dryness. He glanced up once more. Valor held his gaze. No deception. No mockery. Only expectation. Garrick removed the stopper. A faint scent drifted upward, sharp and clean, like air after a thunderstorm. He tipped the vial and drank. The effect was immediate. Cold clarity flooded down his throat and spread through his chest like lightning threading veins. The dryness that had coated his mouth dissolved. The ache behind his eyes eased. Strength, real strength, not stubborn imitation, returned to his limbs in a swift, surging wave. He sucked in a startled breath as sensation sharpened. This was no ordinary water. It tasted like rain caught at the height of a storm, like wind above mountain peaks. He lowered the vial slowly, staring at it in disbelief. Valor watched the transformation closely. Color returned faintly to the human's face. His posture straightened, tension shifting from fragile endurance to grounded steadiness. Life restored. Dead acknowledged. Garrick wiped the back of his hand across his mouth and gave a short, incredulous huff of breath. Stormwater, he murmured, though he did not know the term in draconic speech. He replaced the stopper carefully and stepped forward to return the vial. Valor did not take it immediately. Instead, he nudged it gently back toward the human. Garrick frowned faintly. The dragon's golden gaze did not waver. Keep it. Understanding dawned slowly across Garrick's expression. That's too much, he said, voice low. Valor's injured wing flexed slightly despite pain. Water given in the desert binds stronger than coin or conquest. Take it. Garrick hesitated one final heartbeat. Then he nodded once deeply. "Thank you," he said simply. The word meant nothing to dragon ears. But the bow of his head did. The exchange might have ended there, an improbable moment suspended in fatting light, had the desert chosen peace. Instead, from beyond the western ridge, a distant horn sounded. The note was sharp and unmistakably human. Garrick's head snapped toward the sound. Vaylor's body stiffened instantly, muscles coiling despite exhaustion. Another horn answered, closer. Sarathine lifted her head, nostrils flaring as she drew in air from that direction. "Humans," she rasped. Kadrin pivoted, placing himself slightly between the approaching sound and his injured companions. Garrick climbed the basin slope halfway and peered over the ridge. He did not need to look long. A scouting battalion crested the horizon in disciplined formation, perhaps 30 soldiers mounted and on foot, armor catching the dying light in brief metallic flashes. Their banner, a silver falcon over black field, snapped in the wind. However, his homeland, his former command structure. The lieutenant at their head raised a hand, signaling a halt as his gaze swept the terrain. It would take only seconds for them to spot dragon silhouettes in the ravine. Garrick felt the weight of the stormwater vial in his hand. He looked back down at Vaylor's. The dragon had followed his movement with intense focus. Their eyes met again. Understanding bridged the gap without language. If the battalion saw wounded dragons, they would attack. If the dragons responded in kind, the ravine would become a slaughter ground. Vaylor's wing could not sustain immediate flight. Sarathine's leg would falter under full charge. Kedron alone might take to air cleanly, but not without abandoning his clutchkin. Garrick descended the slope once more, movement swift but controlled. He stopped before Vaylor. "Can you fly?" he asked instinctively. The dragon flexed his torn wing. Membrane trembled uselessly before sagging. "Answer enough." Garrick nodded once to himself. He tucked the stormwater vial securely into his pack. Then he did something that would later be recorded in draconic histories, with no small measure of disbelief. He turned away from the dragons and began climbing the ridge toward the human battalion. Behind him, Kadrin hissed softly, "He goes to summon them." Sarathine's eyes narrowed, "No." Vaylor watched the human's steady ascent. His posture did not suggest betrayal. It suggested resolve. "He gave water," Vaylor said quietly. Kadrin's tail lashed once in agitation, and now he gives warning. Vaylor's golden gaze followed Garrick until he reached the ridge crest and stood silhouetted against the fatting sky. Or, Vaylor murmured, "He gives us time." Above them, the first true stars began to pierce the ash-veiled heavens. The horns sounded again, closer now. Steel clinked faintly against steel as the battalion advanced. And on the ridge between two armies, a single human veteran squared his shoulders and prepared to stand against his own kind for the sake of 3 wounded dragon warriors. In the desert, a drop of water had shifted more than thirst. It had shifted allegiance. Not of kingdom, not of oaths, but of choice. And sometimes, in wars grown too vast to comprehend, it was the smallest choices that altered the course of everything. When fire chose sides, the wind at the ridge's crest carried 2 scents, iron and ash. Garrick Thorne stood between them. Below him in the ravine, 3 dragon warriors waited, wounded and wary, their silhouettes dark against the rising night. Before him, cresting the western rise in disciplined formation, came the soldiers of Haver, steel helms, polished breastplates, mounted outriders fanning to either flank. The silver falcon banner snapped once in a hard gust. Garrick felt the old reflex stir in his chest, the instinct to straighten fully, to bark orders, to assess terrain and calculate angles of engagement. Years of command did not vanish simply because rank had been shed. But he did not reach for authority. He reached for breath. The lieutenant at the battalion's head drew his mount to a halt when he recognized the figure on the ridge. "Hold," he called, raising a gauntleted fist. The line slowed. Metal creaked, sand shifted under boots and hooves. The lieutenant removed his helm. "You," he said, incredulous, "Garrick Thorne." Garrick squinted against the dim light. Recognition settled. Lieutenant Marin Volleys, once a young standard-bearer under Garrick's command at the siege of Coldborough, earnest, ambitious, now carrying himself with the rigid posture of someone promoted too quickly by war. Still breathing, Garrick replied dryly. Marin nudged his horse forward a few paces. His gaze swept past Garrick's shoulder, narrowing. We track smoke, he said, and blood. Our scouts reported dragon descent. He looked directly at Garrick. Where are they? The question hung sharp as a drawn blade. Garrick did not step aside. Wounded, he said simply. Marin's jaw tightened. Then this is fortune, he replied, 3 less beasts to trouble our skis. Behind him, murmurs of agreement rippled through the ranks. A few soldiers adjusted crossbow straps, eyes brightening with predatory anticipation. Garrick felt the weight of 30 sets of human eyes on him. He remembered standing before ranks like this, voice raised over battlefield thunder. He remembered ordering charges, ordering retreats, ordering men into fire because strategy demanded it. He had believed in victory then. He believed in something else now. They're not hunting, Garrick said. Marin frowned faintly. They're dying. The lieutenant's expression hardened. All the better. Garrick stepped forward. Stand down. The words landed heavy. A silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Marin stared at him as though trying to reconcile memory with present reality. You are not in command here, the lieutenant said carefully. No, Garrick agreed, I'm not. He glanced briefly back over his shoulder. Valor had climbed partway up the ravine slope despite injury, massive form visible now from the battalion's vantage point. Serathine stood just behind him, her injured leg trembling under strain. Kedron flanked them, wings half extended in protective posture. 30 human soldiers inhaled sharply in unison. Weapons lifted. Crossbows cocked. Garrick did not turn fully. He lifted one hand instead, palm outward toward the battalion. They could have killed me, he said evenly. Marin's eyes flicked to him again. They didn't. A ripple of confusion moved through the ranks. What are you saying? Marin demanded. Garrick drew in a slow breath. I gave them waters. The statement struck harder than any shouted accusation. You what? Someone whispered. Marin's disbelief sharpened into anger. You shared supplies with enemy combatants. They were dying, Garrick replied. So should they. The words came quick and reflexive from one of the rear soldiers. Garrick's gaze swept across them, boys some of them, scarred veterans among them too, men hardened by siege and flame. I was dying too, he said quietly. They gave back. Marin's expression flickered. What do you mean? Garrick did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly removed his pack and drew forth the crystal vial. Even in fading light, it caught faint starlight and shimmered with inner clarity. Stormwater, he said. A few soldiers recoiled instinctively. Dragon magic was not spoken of lightly. They returned what I gave, Garrick continued, more than I gave. Marin stared at the vial, then at the dragons. And that binds you to them, he asked incredulously. In the desert, Garrick said, voice steady, water's older than war. Behind him, Valor's golden eyes fixed on the exchange, tracking tone if not words. Kedron shifted, tension rippling visibly through his lean frame. They ready weapons, he murmured in draconic speech. I see, Valor replied. Serathine's breath rasped faintly, if they attack. They will not, Valor said. You'd trust him. Valor's gaze did not leave Garrick. Oh yes. On the ridge, Marin exhaled sharply through his nose. You would have us turn away, he said, from wounded dragons. Oh yes. A long silence followed. Wind swept across the dunes, carrying grains of sand that stung exposed skin. Marin leaned forward slightly in his saddle. You taught me strategy, he said quietly enough that only Garrick heard. You taught me never to waste advantage. Garrick's expression softened faintly. And I also taught you, he replied, to know when killing wins nothing. Marin's jaw flexed. Behind him, a sergeant spoke up. Sir, reinforcements could arrive at any moment if we don't strike now. A shadow passed overhead. Not one's. Many. The battalion stiffened as a dark shape blotted starlight. Then another's. And another's. The air pressure shifted as vast wings displaced wind. Garrick turned slowly. Above the ravine, circling at great height, came dragons. Not three. Dozens. Their formations were precise despite darkness, tight spirals maintaining distance yet unmistakably converging on the wounded trio below. Marin looked up, face draining of color. Gods, someone breathed. Valor lifted his head despite pain, signaling skyward with a low, resonant call. It carried far. The circling dragons altered formation slightly in response. They've tracked their own, Marin whispered. If you fire, Garrick said calmly, this becomes a massacre. Marin swallowed. 30 soldiers against dozens of aerial war beasts. Even if they killed the wounded three before reinforcements descended, retaliation would be catastrophic. A deeper shadow began to separate from the circling mass. Larger, older, its wings spanned wider than siege towers. As it descended, air roared around it in a controlled vortex. The sky matriarch. Her scales gleamed like molten bronze even under starlight. Scars traced her flanks, old, pale, marking battles long concluded. Her horns curved back in regal arcs and her eyes, ancient, assessing, glowed faintly as she settled upon the ridge's far edge with seismic force. Sand exploded outward. Horses reared. Several soldiers nearly loosed bolts in reflex before Marin shouted, "Hold." The matriarch folded her wings slowly. Her gaze swept first over the wounded dragons, then over the human battalions, then settled on Garrick. Her voice rolled across the ridge like distant thunder. Why does one of ours stand beside one of yours? The sound vibrated through bone. Several soldiers staggered under its weight. Garrick did not kneel. He stepped forward. Because we were thirsty, he said. A murmur rippled through the circling dragons above. The matriarch's gaze sharpened. Valor stepped forward despite visible strain and lowered his head in formal acknowledgement to her. He spoke in the draconic tongue, measured, precise. He described the ambush, the retreat, the dying wells, the human who approached without weapon, the water given freely, the storm water returned, the human who now stood between armies. The matriarch listened without interruption. When Valor finished, silence followed, deep and contemplative. The matriarch's massive head turned once more toward Garrick. You gave life, she said, this time in careful human speech, each word deliberate, when you possessed little. Garrick shrugged faintly. Seemed right. Marin stared at him as though seeing a stranger. The matriarch studied him longer than comfort allowed. Her gaze pierced without hostility, weighing intent rather than strength. Among our kind, she said, voice resonant and far-reaching, water shared in barren land binds stronger than blood spilled in anger. She lifted her head, addressing both forces. This human has invoked ancient law. The circling dragons altered formation again, no longer poised for dive but for witness. Marin's grip tightened on his reins. You would withdraw, he said carefully, because of this. The matriarch's eyes flicked toward him. We would not slaughter debt repaid with honor. She paused. And we would not dishonor our own by ignoring such law. Seraphine swayed slightly behind Valor, exhaustion overtaking adrenaline now that immediate battle had not erupted. Kadrin stepped closer to steady her flank. Garrick felt the stormwater's strength steadying his own legs. The matriarch's gaze returned to the human battalion. This war has devoured hatchlings and sons, she said. Territory gained has been ash, pride has been grave marker. Her wings shifted slightly, not in threat but emphasis. Tonight fire will not answer steel. The statement hung immense and irrevocable. Marin looked back at his men. They looked to him. Strategy warred visibly with instinct across his features. 30 soldiers. Dozens of dragons. An ancient law invoked. A veteran who once commanded him, now standing unarmed between sides. He exhaled slowly. Lower weapons, he ordered. The command traveled down the line like a physical release. Crossbows dipped. Swords lowered. Not sheathed but lowered. The matriarch inclined her head a fraction. Valor mirrored the motion toward Garrick. The sky dragons above began to disperse slowly, their circling widening outward rather than tightening. Tension ebbed. Not vanished, but eased. Garrick felt something unclench in his chest that had been knotted for years. Marin dismounted slowly and stepped forward, stopping an arm's length from Garrick. You realize, he said quietly, that some will call this treason. Probably, Garrick replied. And if command disputes it? Garrick glanced toward the matriarch, then back to Marin. Then they can argue with dragons. A reluctant huff of breath escaped Marin, half laugh, half exasperation. The matriarch turned her massive head toward Valor. You will be tended, she said, and your debt acknowledged. Valor bowed deeply despite pain. Sarathine and Kadrin followed suit. The matriarch's gaze settled once more on Garrick. You are Garrick Thorne, she said, not a question. He blinked faintly. Word travels, she added. Of course it did. War had long memories. You stand without rank, she observed. By choice, he replied. Her eyes held his. Tonight you stood with honor. She shifted her stance, great wings unfurling partially. This war ends here. Marin stiffened. That is not solely your. It is, she interrupted, not harshly but with finality, because we choose it. She lifted her head higher. Let it be known, dragons will withdraw from contested borderlands at first light. Hostilities cease. Marin stared. You would relinquish advantage. The matriarch's gaze cooled slightly. We relinquish nothing, she said. We choose not to perpetuate folly. Above, the last of the circling dragons began to peel away in disciplined arcs, heading east toward distant mountain silhouettes. Valor looked at Garrick once more. He stepped forward carefully until he stood close enough that Garrick could feel the heat radiating from his scales. The dragon lowered his head, not partially this time. Fully. A bow. Garrick swallowed. He inclined his own head in return. No words. None were needed. Sarathine managed a faint rumbling exhale that might have been relief. Kadrin gave Garrick a long, assessing look, no longer suspicious but contemplative. The matriarch launched skyward in a surge of wind that nearly knocked several soldiers off balance. One by one, additional dragons descended briefly to assist the wounded trio before lifting again toward the mountains. Within minutes, the ravine that had seemed poised for slaughter stood nearly empty. Only sand, scattered footprints, and a dying well remained. The human battalion lingered in stunned quiet. Marin replaced his helm slowly. You understand, he said to Garrick, that history will not record this kindly. Garrick looked out over the desert where dragon shapes diminished into the horizon. History rarely does, he said. He picked up his empty canteen from where it had fallen earlier. It felt impossibly light. Marin studied him. You could return, he offered, command might listen. Garrick shook his head faintly. My war's done. And what will you do? Garrick glanced at the stormwater vial in his pack. He looked toward the mountains, then back toward Haverlands. Walk, he said simply. Marin hesitated. Then he extended a hand. Garrick took it. Old commander and former subordinate stood for a moment in silent acknowledgement. When Marin remounted and signaled withdrawal, the battalion turned west instead of east. No pursuit. No final volley. Just departure. Garrick remained on the ridge until they vanished beyond dunes. Only then did he descend once more to the dying well. He sat where he had before, back against cool stone. The stars burned brighter now, unobstructed by smoke. He let out a slow breath. The desert wind brushed his face. Somewhere far to the east, dragon wings beat in steady rhythm. For the first time in years, the night held no immediate threat. Only quiet. In years to come, scholars and generals would debate why the War of the Ashen Expanse ended so abruptly. They would cite supply strain, overextension, shifting political priorities. Dragons would record it differently. They would speak of ancient law honored. Of a human veteran who gave his last water without expectation. Of a moment when fire chose not to answer steel. And in both histories, though phrased differently, one truth would remain. The course of war changed not by grand strategy, but by a single drop shared in the desert.